Okay, so
Awesome.
now
Awesome.
Q&A.
Thank you, Ted and Joseph. I've been looking at the chat and I don't see any questions that have come through. But I do have some questions on my own. Um, and then maybe we can get started with the first one, which is, and thank you both for your presentations. Of course, no question is a dumb question, so please ask your questions. This is our first time really trying to involve, storytelling as an element to the professional development of, tribal environmental professionals, because oftentimes, like, we're being told, tell a story about your community, and of course, because it's so complex in its own in and of itself, it's like, where do you really begin? And so when Joseph first introduced the 5 beats method to us, I thought that was helpful in terms of, like, how do you begin to frame that story. And so I guess the first question that I'm thinking about is, when it comes to Indigenous storytelling, what are some ethical considerations to be had when you're dealing with, like, sensitive information, or any member of your team? Is there some protocols that need to be adhered to? Just curious to hear about your reflections. Who wants to go first?
Joseph, you've been working on the ground with this stuff longer.
Yeah, so I guess to reiterate the question, some of the ethical um, standards of sensitive information and all of that. Yeah, there's always a lot of that pop up, and there's a lot of concepts of trust that occur. From the legal standpoints of what occurs with, like, even with Standing Rock submitting places of burial sites and then them being destroyed because they shared them. Um, to some of the issues with just ceremonial things. I mean, even in the community, some people won't tell their clans or their Cherokee name. And so one of the things that I've found as I've gotten older is that many times when an elder warns you about something, you should listen to them the first time, because time usually proves them right. And you know, even at your opposition, I would say that often you'll have this frustration because you believe you're right. Is that anytime somebody mentions something to you culturally, I would say that whether you're native or non-native, the cultural relationship you have with somebody is often really important, that you're able to listen to somebody in the way that they're telling you. And so sometimes, often in this community where I'm at, people will tell you once and they won't drill it into your head that it's important. They will mention it to you that it's important. And it's in that idea that in the Western world, somebody really tells you, and and if you talk to them about it back, sometimes that becomes argumentative culturally. So often, if somebody elder that's not saying something about that specific area, you have to be very careful how you respond to maybe maybe it doesn't even feel like criticism, but a statement about including something or not, um, should be thought about before you answer or make any action. So I would say just being very mindful of how the community does it, and what they really want. Really should be based off of their desires, especially the fact that most of the people that you're dealing with, especially when it's a group of elders, uh, often have a better idea of what's happened in the past than you do. And I know, speaking as I had a lot of initiatives throughout my time here in my community, working on different projects. And I would just say that from a standpoint of somebody that's gotten older in that process, learning to listen is the key, and understanding that people don't say it in the way that you might understand it when it's an actual warning to you in your behavior. And so I would say that I see a lot of people come in with a great idea, and even if it like seems like a great idea of doing this or mapping that, if the community doesn't want to do it, even if you don't find value in the fact that that statement makes, you should really pause and rethink your position.
So I guess my response to that question is that is from more an outsider perspective, because even though I've grown up within my own tradition, speak my own language, and know things about my own culture, I'm coming at things from a Pueblo perspective. And going into another community, I can bring in technical expertise, but I'm not necessarily knowledgeable about what it is that is within the cultural worldview of that particular community. So I think, the main thing that is really a cautionary is that you have to educate yourself in terms of advanced education of where it is that you're going into, and what is it that, essentially begins to lay out a way that you can ask intelligent questions, I guess, if nothing else. But that you're really there in your role in order to facilitate, and that it's kind of a reciprocal relationship, because you can raise the conversation within the community like we do when we first explain the kind of techniques, and even begin to explain the types of models, so that they understand the kind of framework that we're working with, and then they reciprocate by then explaining how it is that they think that that model either represents or doesn't represent them. So we refine it, and it's really dynamic, in terms of that kind of engagement and interaction. But without, that balance of those kinds of voices of the outsider and the insider, I think that you don't get very far in terms of actually beginning to build that kind of meaningful engagement.
I think that's a really good response too, and a great segue to a question that had come up in the chat. This is from Oral Salters. He says, "Thank you, Ted and Joseph, for a fantastic presentation and tools. With communities that have histories of conflict, how might we weave various narratives for diverse stakeholders together for a collective vision and healing? Any tips, lessons, or insight?"
Well, I think you're always going to have conflict in any community, quite honestly. Um, and, those are kind of privy to some of the kind of internal dynamics that occur with regards to where it is that individuals themselves position. So I think it can be essentially mitigated by the fact that if you use this 7 generations model, and you really begin to develop a style and approach in which you allow all these voices to be represented, um, all the way from, the youth to the middle to the elder, and those intermediate ones in between, then every one of them, in a sense, has something to contribute to that particular kind of dialogue. And I think, sort of building that kind of community reference then um, is really offsetting the way that we sometimes get ourselves into these kinds of conflicts where you've got particular groups that are determinate. It may be represented in terms of political leadership, or within institutions, or invested in clan systems, or whatever the case is. But I think at the end of the day, by figuring out what is the best way in order to be able to build voices from each of the generations that's represented, it then helps to mitigate the kind of polarization that occurs when people are carrying their own agendas as based on their own individualism, or within the institution that they're affixed to.
Yeah, I would definitely echo some of that on what Ted's saying about, the greater process of the project, thinking it out as a 7 generation or a long-term plan that benefits the community as a whole. When we deal with, the complex just groups of large amount of different people coming in a room, in any tribal community, there's, hard feelings already when people walk in the room. It's, we've lived together for a long time, and so problems occur, and even with relationships with tribal entities or businesses or groups that have come in the past that are similar or even that are not. And so when that occurs,
Oh, Joseph, you muted yourself again.
yeah, I would say that often you have to remind yourself what's important in that process and stay on task of that, because it certainly isn't easy whenever you do. When I was in my 20s, we were trying to design a new font for computer systems, and I had an elder stand up and say that designing a different type of font would destroy the language. And although I did not agree with him, I had to take some time to and it basically it was the fact that he really thought we were talking about something else because of another project that occurred. And so usually it's, if you can think about a longer vision and kind of keep everybody on the same task with as best possible, less partisanship that happens in communities. I've found that to work the best. And obviously it's no silver bullet, but it certainly does move things better for what we've done in the past. So,
yeah, I can give a really couple of good examples of how this kind of plays out in these um, types of sessions. I remember we were working with an indigenous community in Mexico, looking at some of the challenges of themselves trying to maintain their own sort of cultural control. And of course, it's a different thing than the kind of sovereign issues that we're dealing with here. But what was really kind of interesting is that the children were asked the question, and they use basically maps in order to do this, answer this question. And we basically asked them, what places do you like, and or what do you like about your place, and what don't you like about your place, and draw it for us. And it came out in the mix that the kids did not like all the kind of pollution that was occurring, the trash that was being thrown away, the sewer that was going into the water systems, everything that was affecting the kind of quality of the environment there. And that was really polarized in the leadership community, because there was a lot of finger pointing about, well, what are you going to do about it, and why hasn't this been allowed, so on and so forth. But it was the introduction of that by the children that made it safe to talk about in the community. And from that, then there was a really kind of constructive dialogue that began to emerge, because then everybody could take ownership of it, as opposed to the adults who might have been staging it and then essentially, pointing fingers at each other and not getting anywhere around there. Same sort of thing occurred in another community we worked with here in New Mexico, where we had a working group dealing with a comprehensive plan that we were doing. They had all the people from the departments represented there. It was the first introductory meeting. There were upwards of 40 to 50 people that were pretty much the leaders in the community of all these various organizations. And I won't call it a mistake, but it was something that we didn't anticipate. We asked them basically to introduce themselves, basically for our purposes, but then I tagged on and tell us about one thing that you think is a challenge in your community. And oh my God, what was supposed to be a 20-minute session turned into 3 hours. But what it did was it leveled the playing field. Everybody got their issues out there, and it was really interesting to gauge that dynamic at the end, because everybody came in really begrudgingly dragging their feet, like, oh no, here we go again. And at the end, at least, they had reached a kind of consensus that, okay, everything's aired out. We know what we're going to sort of deal with in terms of this challenge. We've gotten over that. We've vented, and let's just kind of move on. So, I think these kinds of things in terms of staging are also part of that kind of context of storytelling as well, too, because everybody's got perspective, but how do you fit that into the greater narrative that the community itself wants to go towards?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that, and then also Joseph's comment about burnout in community, because that was going to be my next question to both of you. Is like, you know, I recall a time too when we had done work out in Wisconsin with the community there, and they were saying, okay, we've been there, done that. Like, how is this process any different from what we've been experienced before, what we've experienced before? And, you know, this is like maybe the nth survey that we've have taken about our community. We're sick and tired of like talking about, you know, what's wrong, what can be done. And so, my question to both of you then, within that community burnout context, how does something like Indigenous storytelling give energy back to the people to keep moving forward in their own ways that they are trying to plan and design for their futures?
I think, what this has also presented is just kind of thinking about, what's the framework that you want to be able to build that story upon. So, these 5 elements, for example, um, are part of our own narrative in terms of our own Indigenous storytelling. I mean, we have coyote stories here in the Southwest, for example, and all of them are based on this kind of moral tale at the end, as people move through these kinds of episodes, I guess if you want to call it, challenges. And as Trickster screws things up, but at the end it kind of resolved and something comes out of it that continues to be part of that type of story that reaches a ultimate resolution, or that at least there's a moral attached to it from that standpoint. So I think, anticipating that structure and how you're going to move people through that narrative in really concrete and deliberate ways, so that at the end of that dialogue, everybody walks away and can tell a story about it. I think that's really a powerful vehicle for building that sense of consensus.
How about you, Joseph? Can you reflect back or think about any experiences in your work that where you've seen maybe a transformation of communities' attitude towards, I guess, a process like language revitalization or planning?
Yeah, I agree with Ted. A lot of times when people when they feel like their narrative is a part of of the process of how things happen, when they're a part of that, it seems to work. For example, like I was working in the community teaching like computer skills, but basically it was out of an Indian education grant that was building the idea of technology skills in communities that don't have computers. And so I'd bring computers in and we'd work with young people that didn't have them. But really I used it as an idea of doing traditional storytelling in the language in animation. And um, and it was the idea that we were able to like get the young people, these 9, 10-year-olds, to go back to their families, their parents and grandparents, and learn stories to come and tell each other. And then they all of a sudden, these kids they were having to do it in the language. And so there was a disconnect between school systems and a lot of the traditional community because of a lot of the historical trauma that a lot of educational systems had caused. And so when we would get finished with them, they started to get interested in it, in the project. But we tried to show the stuff and have a special like screening night at the school, and we didn't get but one parent show up. And so we showed it at the basketball game the next time, and the whole community was there. And then the whole community started to get engaged in the school system and pushed for language courses in the school, and started actually getting more involved in showing up to stuff. And I think it's because once they saw some of the stuff that their students included the narrative of their community, and it looked like their community and felt like their community in an educational environment, the educational environment then to them could be Cherokee, could be language-based, could be all of that. And it kind of changed their perspective of going to school and talking to their teacher about what they're working on. And And all of it was a narrative project of doing a traditional story and an animation in the language. And then they started to like ask about other things for their education was something different after that point for them. And almost all the schools that I taught at had this push for language classes and other curriculum that was including community-based like knowledge, which built the idea of like, how'd your community get here? Like basic stuff like that. They wanted their kids to know that, which weren't normally taught.
That's really interesting, Joseph, because I think, one of the things that we often ourselves get trapped into in terms of being so-called technically astute or researcher or whatever the case is that we ultimately end up literally whitewashing our narratives, in the sense of the fact that let's just take something like a simple PowerPoint, which is a way in order to tell a story, right? To build a narrative. And I can't emphasize how many times I've seen people build these PowerPoints and not even represent people in their own community in that. Instead, they're using white faces or they're using stuff that they've downloaded from Google or whatever the case is. And there's nothing that's much more important and reflective of that kind of ownership than to see their own people, their own places in that. And using that in the sense of that kind of story narrative. The other thing that we certainly do in our reports, and this is something that is just now second nature to us, is we build that documentation using the exact voices of the people themselves. So rather than falling into this notion of, well, let's translate what this kind of means and sort of neutralize that, no, it's really more important and powerful to be able to tell things exactly the way that people themselves say things. So sometimes it's off-putting in the context of these collective meetings to say, we're going to record this, but if you really get a good buy-in from the community and you say, we want to represent these voices, of course, there's protocols attached to that. You don't identify who says it or something of that sort, but you still capture the exact voice itself. And when people see that reflected in that narrative and that report, it's a totally different dimensionality than, just looking at it from a sort of cut, dry, black and white kind of presentation.
Yeah, and we're almost at time too. But one last question I'd like to ask both of you is, why Indigenous storytelling? And if it's like anything that anyone will remember from your presentations, what is it that you want to be taken away from this?
So it's real simple for me. It's all about context. If you can't tell anyone about what it is that you're representing, who it is that you're representing, and why it is that you're representing, then you're dead in the water already. It's all about context.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the land, place, and people are a narrative that aren't based in like a finite ending time like this. Like if you notice, a lot of the stories that people tell you in indigenous communities, they keep going. Like they're so long, and they keep continuing. And often I think that what we have to realize is that the stories are continuing, and they are land and culturally based, and we have to tell them in a way that they are continuing. They're not past tense, that they are like the future of the story is still unfolding, and we're just like a little piece and little speck of that narrative. And if you can tell a narrative about it, like about your community or a community that you work with, in that, often it really comes down to that community voices, and I say that in a plural sense of understanding, because it is that group understanding that really defines an area better than just an individual. So
Yeah, thank you both for your time. And I want to take over or reserve the last minute for Jen to offer a close up with an important part of this process too, which is completing evaluations. Jen?
Yeah, hi. Hi. Thank you so much, Ted and Joseph and Michaela. That was absolutely fantastic. Those presentations were beautiful. The discussion was just rich, and you know, um, I don't even have words for it. It was so great. I don't want it to end, but I do want to bring everyone's attention back to the evaluation. I have it on the screen if you want to just scan the QR code with your smartphone, or the link is in the chat box. But please do complete the evaluation. As I mentioned at the beginning, this does help us not only kind of continue to develop programming and figure out what people's interests are, but it's also kind of a way that we justify being able to keep getting funded. So the evaluations are very, very, very important to us. I'm going to jump. Like I said, the link is in the slide or in the chat box. Our contact information is up here on the screen now. If you have additional questions or questions at all, or thoughts or ideas, or any of those things, once you leave here, please feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we will. We'll be happy to talk with you and engage more with you. You can also send any questions or comments to our K-State email, chsr@ksu.edu. We will be posting materials related to this webinar on the website if they aren't already there, so keep a lookout for that. And again, I really want to thank everyone for attending today, and I hope that you found this as exciting and enriching as I did. It was a fantastic set of speakers and wonderful content and wonderful information. And I think that's all I have. Michaela, do you want to keep going with discussion and people can just jump off if they want to, or do you want to end it for everyone?
I think we can go ahead and end it, unless there really is anybody who has a question, but probably take no more than 5 minutes for that. Just wanting to be respectful of people's time.
Right, and one more thing, I don't want to leave without reminding everyone about the continuation of this event. That's next Thursday, same time, 12 o'clock, except this one goes to 2 o'clock Central. And this is going to be Joseph and Dr. Cynthia Annette, and it's going to be a much more hands-on, kind of applying what we talked about today. So a much more interactive, hands-on, learning some skills and some ideas. How do you take what they talked about today and apply that in your life and your work that you do in your community, and how can you take that back to your community? So again, that's next Thursday, October 8th. At 12 o'clock Central Time. You can register if you are not already on our website, which is the same place that you registered for this, or you can reach out to any one of us and we can help you get registered. I guess that's all I have. Thank you so much, everyone.
All right, yeah, thank you. And again, hopefully it wasn't too far out there with the content that was provided today, but we're really also trying to think through, like, what does Indigenous resilience mean in terms of like the work that happens on the ground with the brownfields projects that you all are working on. So thank you, Kermit, and you're welcome. Just referring to a chat in the box.